The first cold winds of October drifted across the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, carrying with them the faint scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Milbrook was a quiet place, tucked far from the growing industrial centers of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Here, the world still moved at a slow, predictable rhythm. Farmers tended their fields, children chased each other between the modest timber houses, and the church bell marked the passing of each Sunday as faithfully as it had for decades. In the autumn of 1823, the town counted roughly 300 souls, no more, no less. Most families had lived on this land for generations, their names etched into the gravestones of the small cemetery behind the Methodist church. Outsiders passed through only occasionally, usually traveling merchants or peddlers seeking rest at the town's single inn. Milbrook was the kind of place where strangers were greeted with polite suspicion and where news traveled by word of mouth long before it reached the newspapers. But that year, something in Milbrook felt wrong. 17 unexplained deaths had shaken the town in just 3 months. The people whispered that perhaps it was a fever or a strange new illness. Others blamed the unusually wet spring that had spoiled crops and brought rats into barns. But what made these deaths truly unsettling wasn't their number. It was the fact that every single body had been prepared for burial by the same family, the Hartwells. To most residents, the Hartwell funeral parlor was not a place of fear. It was a place of comfort. For more than 2 decades, Ezekiel and Martha Hartwell had cared for the dead with a kind of tenderness that seemed almost sacred. Ezekiel's voice was gentle, his movements slow and deliberate. Martha was known for bringing fresh bread or pies to grieving families, offering warm words and soft prayers. Their eldest son, Josiah, had inherited his father's precision and skill. Caleb assisted with grave digging and carpentry, while their daughter Rebecca, the youngest, was often seen holding the hands of widows or children during funerals. The Hartwells represented everything Milbrook believed about itself: decency, community, and faith. Yet beneath that surface, something darker stirred. On the morning of October 15, 1823, a horse-drawn carriage rolled into Milbrook carrying a man whose arrival would unravel the town's most cherished illusions. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the state's traveling health inspector, appeared at the inn just past sunrise. He was a tall, thin man of 48, with sharp eyes and a calm, observant demeanor. His annual visits were routine, checking sanitation, examining water sources, verifying burial practices. Most towns hardly noticed him, but this year would be different. After completing a brief inspection of the market and grain storage, Dr. Harrison made his way toward the stone building at the edge of town, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor. The structure was impressive for such a small community. 3 stories of blue-gray stone, its foundation half sunk into the hillside. A wooden addition extended from its rear, where coffins were built and bodies prepared for burial. As the doctor approached, the door opened, and Ezekiel Hartwell stepped out with a welcoming smile. "Dr. Harrison, is it? We've been expecting you," he said warmly. "Please, come inside. We are honored to show you our facilities." The doctor followed him through the doorway. The interior carried the faint scent of pine and lavender, an attempt, perhaps, to mask the lingering odor of chemicals and preserved bodies. On the main floor, the parlor was arranged with simple dignity. Dark wood chairs, a narrow staircase leading upward to the family's living quarters, and lace curtains drawn to soften the light. Josiah Hartwell emerged from the back room as if summoned. He wiped his hands on a white apron and offered a polite bow. His face was gaunt, but his posture confident, almost rehearsed. "Doctor, we keep everything as clean as possible," he said. "We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards." Dr. Harrison nodded, but said nothing. His gaze drifted to the staircase leading downward into the basement. That was where the true work happened. The inspection began smoothly. The embalming tables were spotless. Tools were arranged with unnatural precision. Glass bottles containing solutions of alcohol, formal compounds, and arsenic, commonly used at the time, were neatly labeled. Everything appeared in perfect order. "Too perfect. May I examine the bodies currently in your care?" the doctor asked. Ezekiel hesitated for the briefest moment. It was small, almost indiscernible, but Dr. Harrison noticed. "Of course, Ezekiel finally replied. "We have 3 prepared for burial this week." They led him to a quiet room where 3 bodies lay covered with white sheets. The first was Eleanor Fairchild, a 70-year-old widow who had supposedly died of consumption. As Dr. Harrison gently lifted the collar of her burial dress, he froze. There, across the pale skin of her neck, were faint bruises. Oval-shaped, symmetrical, consistent with strong fingers tightening around her throat. "Post-mortem bruising," Josiah said quickly, sensing the doctor's reaction. "She slipped during preparation. A regrettable accident." But Josiah's voice trembled slightly, betraying something he could not hide. The second body was Marcus Webb, a healthy middle-aged farmer who had allegedly collapsed from a heart attack. When the doctor examined his chest and arms, he found small puncture wounds, precise, deliberate, far too clean to be caused by farm tools or a fall. Again, Ezekiel offered an explanation that did not match the evidence. But it was the third body, the young Mother Mary Patterson, that removed all doubt. Around her mouth and under her fingernails, Dr. Harrison found traces of a white powder. He recognized it instantly. Arsenic, a poison all too common, yet unmistakable to a trained eye. The air in the room seemed to tighten. The doctor felt the weight of several pairs of eyes watching him. Martha had appeared silently in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Rebecca stood just behind her, her youthful face calm, almost too calm. As the doctor moved between bodies, the family stood still and quiet, as though waiting for him to finish a performance they had already anticipated. When the examination ended, Ezekiel clasped his hands. "Is everything satisfactory, doctor?" Dr. Harrison forced a polite smile. "He'll need to review my notes." That evening, he sat alone in a dim corner of the Milbrook Inn. Candlelight flickered across the pages of his notebook as he wrote down the symptoms, bruises, punctures, and chemical traces he had discovered. His medical training left no room for doubt. At least 3 of these deaths were murders. But how could he accuse an entire family, one loved and trusted by every soul in the region, of systematic killing? Without undeniable proof, no magistrate would believe him. Worse, the Hartwells themselves had sensed his suspicions. Their smiles had grown thinner. Their eyes had grown watchful. As he pondered his next step, several townsfolk entered the inn. They greeted the doctor politely, then sat near him with an almost conspiratorial caution. "We heard you visited the Hartwells today," one woman whispered. Another man leaned in. "Strange things happening lately, doctor. People dying suddenly. Folks who were healthy just days before. That family always shows up quick when someone falls ill," another muttered. "Too quick, if you ask me." The doctor listened as the townspeople spoke in hushed tones. Stories of elderly parents who grew unexpectedly sick after Martha's visits, of neighbors whose bodies were handled unusually fast, of faint rumors that no one dared pursue. A pattern was emerging, a frightening one. When the crowd dispersed, the doctor sat alone again, staring at his notes. He felt as though the walls of the inn were closing in, as though the darkness outside pressed against the windows with deliberate intent. There was no denying it now. Something horrific was happening in Milbrook, and the Hartwell family was at its center. He closed his notebook, extinguished the candle, and climbed the narrow staircase to his room. But sleep did not come. Every creak of the inn, every gust of wind on the shutters, set his nerves on edge. At one point, he swore he heard footsteps outside his door, soft, careful, deliberate. Morning brought no comfort. For the first time in his years of travel, Dr. Harrison feared not just for a community, but for his own life. And though he could not yet prove it, he knew he had stepped into something far more sinister than a routine health inspection. Something ancient, methodical, hidden beneath decades of trust. The Hartwell family wore kindness like a mask. And behind that mask, the doctor sensed the presence of something monstrous. Something that had killed 17 people in 3 months, and perhaps many more before that. When the Hartwell family arrived in Milbrook in the autumn of 1801, no one in the small Pennsylvania town had any reason to suspect that they carried with them a history steeped in shadows. They came as strangers, traveling in a sturdy wagon drawn by 2 weathered horses, their belongings packed neatly in wooden trunks. A new family seeking a new start. That was all the townspeople saw. But the truth of the Hartwells began long before they crossed into Pennsylvania, far back in the wooded hills of Western Virginia, where their story had already begun to twist into something dark. The Hartwells presented themselves as a hard-working, God-fearing family escaping economic hardship. Ezekiel, the patriarch, was a man with stern features and disciplined posture, the kind of figure who commanded instant respect. Martha, his wife, had the appearance of a devoted mother, soft-spoken, composed, with an air of simple domestic warmth. Their children, Josiah, Caleb, and young Rebecca, appeared well-behaved and obedient. Together, they looked like any other family moving toward hope and opportunity. But behind their calm eyes lived secrets, carefully hidden. The family had not left Virginia because of drought or debt, as they claimed. They left because people had started to whisper, quietly at first, then more boldly, about strange activities surrounding the dead. In the early years, Ezekiel had been known as a helpful neighbor, a skilled carpenter, and someone who understood the handling of bodies after death better than most. Funerary customs in rural communities were informal. Families washed their dead at home, built their own coffins, and buried them on local land. But Ezekiel had studied embalming methods from an uncle in Richmond, or so he said. He offered assistance with the dead, and people gratefully accepted. The first suspicions arose after a series of unusual thefts. Rings removed from fingers, earrings gone missing, burial garments stripped from corpses. These instances were dismissed at first. Perhaps animals had disturbed a grave, perhaps thieves had wandered in from the road. Yet the pattern persisted, and some began to question whether the dead were being robbed by someone with access to their graves. The rumors grew louder after the death of a merchant named Samuel Price, whose family claimed that the coffin they opened before burial seemed strangely light. When the lid was lifted, the body was gone. The grave digger swore he had left it there. The coffin maker swore he had not touched it. But no one ever considered Ezekiel Hartwell, who had prepared the body earlier that day. It was Martha who first convinced him that they needed to leave Virginia. Too many questions. Too many coincidences piling one on top of another. And so the family packed their belongings, sold their property for a surprisingly large sum in gold, gold whose origins no one could trace, and headed north. They carried with them more than trunks and tools. They carried experience, practice, and the knowledge that most communities never looked closely at what happened behind closed doors. When they arrived in Milbrook, they purchased the old stone house overlooking the valley. The house had once belonged to a wealthy landowner who died suddenly that same year. His surviving relatives had been eager to sell the property cheaply, wanting to return to Philadelphia as quickly as possible. The Hartwells paid in gold coins, bright and heavy, which drew a few curious glances but no outright suspicion. After all, a family's finances were their own business, and gold spoke louder than questions. From the beginning, Ezekiel established himself as a professional. He converted a section of the house into a viewing parlor, built an addition for preparation and embalming, and set aside a room in the basement for what he called scientific work. The people of Milbrook were skeptical at first. A funeral parlor? In a town this small? They had always handled their own dead. Why pay someone to do what families had done for generations? But Ezekiel was patient. He offered his services freely at first. When old Mrs. Thorne passed away that winter, he prepared her body with tenderness and precision. The family, overwhelmed with grief, thanked him endlessly. Word spread that the Hartwells treated the dead with dignity unlike anything the town had seen. That spring, when a young man died in a logging accident, his parents entrusted his body to Ezekiel as well. Slowly, the community adapted. What had once seemed unnecessary now felt comforting, almost modern. Yet beneath this new trust lay an invisible current. For while the townspeople saw compassion, the Hartwells saw opportunity. Their first months in Milbrook were quiet. They settled in, observed the people, learned who lived alone, who struggled with illness, who had no close relatives. They learned the rhythms of the town, the times when houses sat empty, the habits of families, the flow of nightly life. And they waited. The winter of 1801-1802 was severe. Bitter winds tore across the valley, freezing wells and driving families indoors. During that harsh season, 8 residents died. A few were elderly, but others were unexpectedly taken. neighbors who had complained only days before of mild discomfort or fatigue. The town doctor, a tired man with limited resources, attributed the surge in deaths to the cold, poor nutrition, and respiratory infections. No one questioned him. People trusted their doctor, and they trusted the Hartwells, who prepared every body with the same meticulous care. But those 8 deaths were not the work of winter. They were the beginning of the Hartwell method. Martha, who had always been seen as gentle and nurturing, made herself indispensable to the sick. She arrived with warm soups, herbal teas, and remedies that she claimed would bring comfort. Her presence soothed the fearful. Her hands were soft, her voice reassuring. But sometimes, hidden within her teas and broths, were powders she carried in small cloth packets, substances that weakened the body gradually, mimicking the symptoms of illness. A few doses caused fatigue. More caused fever. A final measure brought death. When a victim died, the Hartwells were already waiting. Ezekiel arrived at the doorstep within hours, offering help without charge. Josiah built the coffin. Caleb dug the grave. Rebecca comforted the grieving children, whispering prayers with innocent sincerity. The family's kindness was overwhelming enough to disarm even the most suspicious minds. What no one noticed was how closely the Hartwells studied each death. How Ezekiel took notes on the condition of the bodies. How Josiah inspected organs with the precision of a surgeon. How Martha recorded which poisons produced which symptoms. The basement of their home slowly filled with jars containing preserved specimens, lungs hardened by disease, hearts weakened by toxins, and organs dissected with chilling thoroughness. Their crimes in those early years were clumsy compared to what they would later become. They made mistakes. They selected victims too quickly. They experimented without fully understanding the consequences. But each misstep taught them something. Each death refined their skill. Each burial deepened their confidence. As their reputation grew, so did their boldness. By 1807, the family began to move beyond poison. They experimented with asphyxiation, noting how marks could be hidden beneath clothing. They tested the effects of blunt force trauma, learning how to mimic falls or accidents. They practiced manipulating limbs and joints post-mortem to create the illusion of sudden collapse. Their knowledge of anatomy expanded far beyond what any mortician should have known. But it was their method of choosing victims that truly defined their evolution. They targeted those who were isolated, elderly widows, travelers, those without close family. They selected individuals whose deaths would bring sadness, but not enough suspicion to prompt investigation. They avoided the powerful, the young, the prominent. They learned to wait, to watch, to integrate themselves into the fabric of the town so completely that no one could imagine life without them. By 1815, the Hartwells were no longer merely a funeral family. They had become a machine. Each member played a role. Each death was planned. Each funeral masked a crime. And always, the community trusted them. The Hartwells attended church every Sunday, hosting gatherings at their home, donating food to the poor, supporting the local school. Their children grew up among the other town's youth. Josiah worked alongside local men during barn raisings. Caleb hunted with neighbors in the woods. Rebecca befriended girls her age, learning their secrets, their family troubles, their weaknesses. To Milbrook, the Hartwells were a blessing. To themselves, they were artists perfecting a craft. As the years passed, their basement grew more sophisticated. Ezekiel installed reinforced shelves for specimens. He constructed a concealed cabinet behind a stone wall. He acquired new tools, saws, clamps, delicate knives, that were far beyond what any funeral parlor needed. And through it all, the family's journal expanded page by page, filled with observations, experiments, and names of those who had fallen to their hands. By the time Dr. Harrison arrived in 1823, the Hartwells had murdered dozens. 17 deaths in 3 months were only the latest surge in their long, hidden history. A surge caused not by clumsiness, but by overconfidence, and arrogance built on 22 years of getting away with murder. Milbrook believed the Hartwells were guardians of the dead. But the family had always been something else entirely. The creators of death, the orchestrators of illness, the silent watchers who stood at the edge of every grave. And now, for the first time in decades, someone had begun to see through their mask. Someone who would not be fooled by warm smiles or gentle words. Someone who had already noticed the marks they had failed to hide. Someone who would soon force their past to claw its way to the surface. Dr. Harrison had arrived, and the Hartwell family's long shadow was about to be illuminated. Night settled heavily over Milbrook, cloaking the quiet town in shadows. The church bell had long since stopped ringing, and the narrow dirt road stood empty beneath the pale glow of the moon. Inside the Milbrook Inn, Dr. Samuel Harrison sat alone at a small wooden table, replaying the events of the day through his weary mind. The marks on Eleanor Fairchild's neck, the punctures on Marcus Webb's chest, the powder on Mary Patterson's lips, the strange tension inside the Hartwell home, the way their eyes followed him, calculating, measuring. The doctor knew he had discovered something unnatural, something that lived beneath the surface of this peaceful town like rot beneath healthy bark. He had seen foul play before, but nothing like the quiet, collective vigilance of an entire family. The Hartwells were not careless criminals. They were careful, organized, and after 20 years in this community, they were trusted with an almost religious devotion. Now Dr. Harrison had to decide what to do. Reporting his findings without evidence would only stir the town against him. Accusing the Hartwells outright could put his own life in immediate danger. He had seen the way Martha's eyes had lingered on him, watchful, cold, weighing possibilities. As he sat deep in thought, he heard a soft knock at the back door of the inn. Not the main door where travelers entered, but the smaller one behind the kitchen, a door used only by staff. The knock came again, urgent but restrained, like someone who feared being heard. Dr. Harrison rose slowly, unsure whether to open it. His instincts screamed caution. Yet the knock persisted, 3 times, then silence. Finally, he approached, unlatched the wooden bolt, and cracked the door open. Standing in the darkness was an elderly man wrapped in a thin wool cloak, his breath trembling visibly in the cold air. His eyes, pale, watery, exhausted, held a desperation that startled the doctor. Dr. Harrison, the old man whispered. It's me, Thomas Creed. The doctor recognized the name at once. Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's aging father. The frail man he had glimpsed earlier in the funeral parlor, sitting quietly in the corner as though trying to disappear into the wallpaper. At the time, he had seemed harmless. Now, seeing him shaking in the shadows, Dr. Harrison sensed something different, fear. Please, Creed whispered, glancing over his shoulder, let me inside. Quickly, the doctor stepped aside, and the old man slipped in like a frightened animal fleeing a predator. As soon as the door closed behind him, Creed leaned heavily against the wall, clutching his chest. They know, he murmured. They know you saw too much. You must listen. You must listen now if you want to stay alive. Dr. Harrison guided him to a chair near the dim lantern light. Creed's hands trembled violently. His fingernails were yellowed and cracked, his skin paper-thin, his breath labored. The doctor noticed bruises on the man's forearms, small, circular, strangely patterned. He recognized them. Poison. Slow-acting. Administered in doses. Mr. Creed, the doctor said quietly, tell me what's happening. The old man swallowed hard, as though gathering courage for something he had feared for years. It's my family, he whispered. My daughter. My son-in-law. My grandsons. Rebecca, he stopped, his voice breaking. I should have spoken long ago, but I was weak. And now I am dying. Dr. Harrison leaned closer. Creed's eyes filled with tears, not from grief, but from shame. You are not imagining any of it, he said. Those people they've been burying, they were murdered. Every one of them. And the ones you examined today, they weren't the first. They have been killing for years. The words hung in the air like a cold, suffocating mist. Dr. Harrison didn't speak. He let the old man continue, knowing he had just cracked open the door to the darkest part of the Hartwell legacy. It began small, Creed whispered. Back in Virginia, Ezekiel robbed graves at first, digging up fresh dead, taking jewelry, teeth, anything he could sell. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself it was theft, not murder. Then one night, a man who was gravely ill, he died sooner than expected. I knew Ezekiel had helped him along, but by then we were already involved. Moving bodies. Keeping secrets. Once he crossed that line, he never looked back. Creed rubbed his temples as though trying to hold his mind together. When we fled Virginia, It wasn't because of money or opportunity. It was because people began to talk. They noticed missing jewels, empty graves, and there were questions about a death that didn't seem natural. Dr. Harrison felt a chill move down his spine. In the dim light, Creed seemed almost ghostly, a man trying to atone at the final hour. In Milbrook, he continued, things grew far worse. They became organized, efficient. Ezekiel realized that in a quiet town like this, people trust their neighbors. They trust the ones who prepare their dead. And if someone were to die unexpectedly, well, grief blinds people. They don't look too closely. His voice cracked. Martha became the worst of them, he whispered. My own daughter. She learned how to poison slowly, how to mimic illness, how to make people depend on her help. Josiah and Caleb, they learned anatomy, how to kill without leaving marks. And Rebecca, he closed his eyes. She's young, but she's clever. She listens. She watches. She knows who is lonely, who will not be missed. The doctor sat frozen, listening as the old man unfolded years of horror. Creed leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. They have a room in the basement that you did not see, he said. A hidden room behind the stone wall. I know where the key is. Inside that room, he took a shuddering breath. You'll find their journals, records, drawings, experiments, and specimens. They've killed more than this town will ever know. How many? Dr. Harrison whispered. Creed hesitated. 40, at least, he said. Maybe more. They keep count. They document everything like scientists. Ezekiel believes he is learning something about death itself. I think he has lost his mind. I think he enjoys it now. A silence followed, heavy with dread. Why are you telling me this? The doctor asked quietly. Creed looked up with hollow, desperate eyes. Because I am dying, he said. They've been poisoning me for months. Small doses. Enough to make me weak. Enough to keep me quiet. They think I want notice. But I know their methods better than anyone. His hands gripped the doctor's sleeve. And because you are not safe. They saw how you reacted today. They know you saw things you should not have seen. Tonight at dinner, Martha said you asked too many questions. Josiah suggested you leave town early. But Ezekiel, he watched you with the look he gets before they act. Dr. Harrison's throat tightened. Creed continued. They will kill you, he whispered. Unless you act first. The doctor felt a surge of cold fear, but also resolve. What can I do? He asked. Creed's voice dropped to a whisper. They go to church every Sunday. All of them. They leave at 10 and return around 1. That is your only chance. I will show you where the hidden key is. You must go into the basement when they are gone. You must gather whatever evidence you can. The journal, the drawings, the specimens. Enough to convince the authorities. He wiped sweat from his brow, trembling. I will leave for Philadelphia during that time. They will think I wandered off in confusion. They want search immediately. That will buy us both time. Dr. Harrison struggled to absorb everything. Breaking into the Hartwell home was dangerous beyond measure. If the family returned early, or if the evidence was gone, or if Creed was lying, you have no reason to trust me, the old man said softly. But I swear to you, everything Eve said is true. And if you wait, if you hesitate, more people will die. He paused, shaking violently. And you won't make it out of Milbrook alive. The lantern flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Dr. Harrison saw the terror in the old man's eyes. It wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the fear of being too late. The fear of dying without stopping the evil he had helped conceal for 2 decades. At last, Creed reached into his cloak and pulled out a small iron key wrapped in cloth. It was ornate, old-fashioned, cold to the touch. This opens the hidden panel in the basement, he whispered. Behind the shelves with the embalming jars. And behind that their laboratory. For a moment, neither man spoke. Creed's breaths grew shallow. His skin turned gray in the dim light. I don't have much time, he said. Please. You must do what I could not. He stood shakily, leaning on the table for support. When the church bell rings on Sunday morning, he said, that is your signal. Do not go in before they leave. Do not let anyone see you enter the house. And whatever you do, his voice broke. Do not let them catch you. He reached for the door, then looked back one final time. I am sorry for what my family has done, he whispered. God help us both. With that, he slipped into the night, disappearing into the darkness behind the inn. Dr. Harrison locked the door, then held the key in his trembling palm. The weight of it felt heavier than iron. It felt like a promise, a warning, a responsibility he had not sought but could no longer refuse. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the distant echo of something unsettled. The doctor extinguished the lantern and sat alone in the darkness, listening to the creaking walls, the rustling leaves, the faraway cry of an owl. Sleep did not come. His mind replayed Creed's words over and over, each repetition carving deeper into his thoughts. When dawn finally crept over the valley hours later, he still sat awake, unable to shake the feeling that the house on the hill was watching him even from a distance, waiting. Sunday was approaching, and with it, the moment when the truth, or something far worse, would be revealed. Sunday morning arrived with a cold, metallic stillness that seemed to settle over Milbrook like a warning. Frost glistened on fence rails and rooftops, and a thin white veil clung to the grass in the fields. The town moved slowly, as though the air itself resisted motion. Dr. Samuel Harrison stood at the window of his small room in the inn, watching as the sky shifted from violet to gray, his heart pounding with a mixture of determination and dread. He hadn't slept, not even for a moment. All night he replayed the words of Thomas Creed, the fear in the old man's voice, the tremor in his hands, the confession that had peeled away the last illusion surrounding the Hartwell family. The key Creed had given him sat on the bedside table, glinting in the weak morning light. Every time the doctor's eyes drifted toward it, he felt the same chill. The chill of knowing he now held access to a chamber built for horror. When the church bell finally tolled its first slow, solemn note, it echoed through the valley like a summons. The sound shivered in the air, stirring the doctor's resolve. He slipped the iron key into his coat pocket, tied his scarf tight, and stepped out into the cold, his breath fogging instantly. He moved quickly but carefully through the narrow side streets, keeping close to the shadows. From a distance, he could see the Hartwell family walking toward the church, 5 silhouettes moving with calm, practiced dignity. Ezekiel led, Martha at his side, their children following behind in a tidy line. They looked like every other Sunday morning. Respectable, devout, devoted. But now the doctor saw what he had not seen before. The precision, the perfect timing, the way their eyes swept the road behind them, checking everything, trusting nothing. Predators heading to worship. He stayed hidden until the family disappeared into the church and the doors shut behind them. He waited another 10 minutes, just as Creed had instructed, knowing the Hartwells always lingered inside for greetings, blessings, and the pastor's early message. Then, with a deep breath to steady himself, he made his way toward the stone house on the hill. The funeral parlor stood silent under the gray sky, its windows dark, its porch empty. The stillness around it was unnatural, like a held breath. Dr. Harrison hesitated before placing his hand on the side door handle, the same door families used when bringing their dead. He pushed it open. The hinges made no sound. He stepped inside. The air was colder than the morning outside, heavy with the faint scent of disinfectant, dried flowers, and something metallic lurking beneath. The wooden floor creaked softly under his weight as he moved deeper into the parlor. Every shadow felt alive. Every corner shifted in his peripheral vision. He closed the door behind him, locking out the world. What happened next, he knew, would define whether he lived or died. He crossed the main room and approached the narrow staircase leading to the basement. As he descended the steps, each creak seemed to echo with accusation, as though the house itself objected to his presence. The basement appeared exactly as it had during his inspection. Spotless embalming tables, rows of neatly labeled jars, a cabinet of tools gleaming in precise arrangement. But now, knowing what Creed had told him, the cleanliness felt sinister, like a mask concealing something monstrous. He scanned the stone wall. Behind the shelves, Creed had said. The doctor moved the shelves aside, his hands shaking despite his effort to stay composed. Dust swirled in the cold air. Behind the shelf, the stones looked identical to the rest of the wall. But when he ran his fingers along the mortar line, he felt a tiny indentation, a slot just wide enough to fit the iron key. He inserted it. The mechanism inside groaned faintly, then clicked. A seam appeared. A door disguised as stone swung inward on silent hinges. The smell that rolled out was thick and wet, and clung to the skin. Dr. Harrison swallowed hard and stepped inside. The hidden room was larger than he imagined, long, windowless, carved into the hillside. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, their flames still warm, as if someone had been here recently. Shelves lined the walls, filled with hundreds of glass jars. Within them floated organs, hearts, lungs, livers, eyes, preserved in chemical solutions, each labeled with dates and notes written in meticulous handwriting. The sight made the doctor's stomach twist. This was no funeral laboratory. This was a workshop of death. In the center of the room stood a wooden lectern, and on it lay the journal. Its leather cover was cracked from decades of use, its pages swollen slightly with age and chemicals. Dr. Harrison opened it, and the moment he did, the air seemed to grow colder. Each page was filled with records. Victim names, symptoms induced, methods tested, poisons administered, observations on suffering, measurements of time, successes, failures, refinements. It read not like a diary, but like a medical textbook written by a mind devoid of empathy. There were sketches, anatomical drawings, diagrams of wounds, illustrations of incisions executed with surgical precision. One page described Eleanor Fairchild's murder in detail. Another showed the exact method used on Marcus Webb. Another outlined a schedule of doses given to Mary Patterson. The doctor's hands shook so badly he could barely turn the pages. He forced himself to continue. He found entries dating back to 1801, deaths the town had attributed to fever and winter illness. He found names of travelers, farmhands, single mothers, widows, elderly men with no relatives. Each name was accompanied by details of how their death had been orchestrated. Then he saw something worse. Drawings of bodies, still living, cut open for study. Descriptions of pain responses. Notes on how long certain poisons took to kill. Charts documenting how fear altered a victim's breathing, pulse, and reflexes. He felt suddenly lightheaded, gripping the lectern to keep from collapsing. This wasn't simply murder. It was experimentation, a systematic obsession with the mechanics of death. Something caught his eye, a separate section of the journal marked with a red ribbon. He opened it and recoiled. Written in neat script was a list titled Candidates. Below it were names. Dozens of them. People in Milbrook. People he had met in the town. People who were still alive. Names had notes beside them. Isolated. Weak respiratory system. Complains of joint pain. No close kin. Sarah Payton's mother. Martha will approach soon. He felt the blood drain from his face. The town was not just living beside killers. The town was a farm. The Hartwells were harvesting. He closed the journal, forcing himself back to the shelves. He needed evidence. Anything he could carry. He slipped the journal inside his coat, gathered several anatomical drawings, tore relevant pages from ledgers, and placed them in his medical bag. As he reached for another sheet of parchment, he heard something. A sound from upstairs. A door closing. Footsteps. Voices. His heart stopped. They weren't at church. They had come home early. The doctor blew out the lanterns in the hidden room and slipped out, closing the stone door behind him. The basement was now dim, lit only by a sliver of gray morning light filtering down the stairwell. He moved swiftly toward the opposite wall, searching for any other way out. Then he saw it. Behind a row of embalming tables, partially concealed by a canvas sheet, lay another door, low, wooden, weathered. He pulled it open and found a narrow tunnel descending sharply into darkness. He hesitated only a second. Footsteps were coming down the stairs. He ducked into the tunnel, closing the door behind him as silently as he could. As the darkness swallowed him, he heard Ezekiel Hartwell's voice rising from the basement stairs. "Someone has been here." The doctor froze. The tunnel was pitch black. The air was damp and cold, and it smelled of earth and something faintly sweet, decay. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small matchbook. He struck a match, its flame weak and trembling. The tunnel stretched deep into the hill, carved with rough tools, sloping downward into the unknown. Behind him came the sound of feet spreading across the basement floor. Josiah's voice. Caleb's heavy tread. Martha's low whisper. Rebecca's soft footsteps like a ghost moving over stone. "Find him," Ezekiel growled. The doctor swallowed the rising panic and moved deeper into the tunnel. His match burned low, then died, leaving him blind. He struck another. Its brief flash revealed dripping walls, dirt floors, the faint outline of wooden beams supporting the passage. He walked as quietly as he could, but every breath, every heartbeat felt deafening. Then he heard something ahead, a faint hollow sound, an opening. He entered a wider space, a cave carved into the hill. His match revealed shelves of stone covered in bones, piles of clothing, scattered shoes, locks of hair tied with string, items stripped from bodies before burial. But the worst were the bodies. Dozens of them. Some arranged like specimens, dissected or partially preserved. Others tossed aside like waste. Others recent, faces pale, eyes half open, mouths twisted in frozen fear. He recognized some of them. People whose funerals he had attended days ago. The match burned his fingers, and he let it fall, crushing it beneath his boot. Behind him, the tunnel filled with distant voices. He's in here. Check the cave. Spread out. Dr. Harrison felt the walls closing in. He scanned the cave for any exit, striking match after match until at last the flame illuminated a narrow fissure near the back, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He forced his body into the crevice, scraping his shoulders against the stone. The match flickered, then went out, plunging him into darkness. He pulled himself through the narrow passage with desperate strength, the stone tearing at his hands. Behind him, the Hartwells entered the cave. Their voices echoed against the stone. He was here. He saw everything. He cannot leave. Rebecca's voice, soft as a child's prayer, drifted into the tunnel. He's close. I can feel it. Dr. Harrison pushed himself deeper, the passage opening at last into a slope leading upward. He crawled on hands and knees, breathing hard, until the air grew colder, fresher. Light appeared. Not lantern light, daylight. He burst from the hillside, tumbling into a thicket of dead branches. The forest behind the Hartwell home stretched wide before him, dense, tangled, alive with shadows. He scrambled to his feet and ran, crashing through underbrush, not daring to look back. Only when the voices faded into the distance did he slow, gasping, clutching his bag of evidence. He was alive. But Thomas Creed was not waiting at the rendezvous point. The path was empty, the woods silent. The doctor continued running until Milbrook was only a distant silhouette behind the trees. By nightfall, he was miles away, heading toward Philadelphia with the journal pressed against his chest like a lifeline. Behind him, the Hartwell home burned with candlelight late into the night. Its doors locked, its secrets hidden, its predators waiting. And somewhere inside, in a locked upstairs room, Thomas Creed was no longer breathing. The hunt had begun, but the truth, at last, had escaped their grasp. Dawn broke slowly over the Pennsylvania countryside as Dr. Samuel Harrison stumbled through the wet underbrush, the stolen journal clutched tightly against his chest. His clothes were torn, his hands raw from scraping against stone, and his breath came in ragged bursts. But he did not stop. Not for a moment. Behind him, somewhere beyond the hills, the Hartwell family was searching, calmly, methodically, with the same patience they used on their victims. He knew they would not give up easily. He knew they would kill to protect their secrets. He knew he had only hours, perhaps minutes, before the hunt widened. By the time the sun rose fully, he had put several miles between himself and Milbrook. He followed animal paths through the forest and avoided open fields, fearing that any glimpse of movement might draw the Hartwells to him. He drank from a creek, steadying his breathing, and checked the contents of his medical bag again. The journal, the anatomical drawings, the pages detailing poison doses, the list of future candidates, everything he needed to prove the truth. But as the day unfolded, one thing became unbearably clear. Thomas Creed had not made it out. The rendezvous point was empty. No footprints. No sign of struggle. Only silence. Dr. Harrison knew the old man had likely been discovered the moment the family returned home. Perhaps they found his cloak missing. Perhaps Rebecca noticed a glance he should not have taken. Perhaps Martha sensed something in the air. Whatever had happened, Creed was gone. His last act had been to give the doctor a chance. By the time night fell again, Dr. Harrison reached a neighboring township, exhausted, bruised, half-frozen. The local sheriff, a stern man with a thick beard, listened politely as the doctor told his story. But his expression never once shifted from skeptical caution. "You're telling me," the sheriff said slowly, "that the Hartwells, who've prepared nearly every burial in Milbrook for 20 years, are murderers? And not just murderers, but some sort of death cult?" The doctor placed the journal on the table between them. "Read it," Harrison said softly. "Read any page. Choose one at random." The sheriff hesitated, then opened it. The color drained from his face. 2 hours later, with torches and rifles, a lawman escort headed toward Milbrook to arrest the Hartwell family and secure the property. Dr. Harrison traveled with them, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and raw fear. But when they reached the town, the house stood empty. The front door hung ajar, swinging gently in the night wind. Fires still burned inside. Candles melted down to pools of wax. Tools lay scattered across the floor, papers torn, drawers emptied. The Hartwells' beds were stripped bare, their clothes gone. They had vanished. A farmer claimed to have seen their wagon rolling westward at dusk. Another said he saw them leaving in a hurry, Martha urging the horses forward with unusual haste. No one dared approach. No one questioned them. No one imagined the horrors they left behind. The lawmen searched the house for evidence, but the hidden chamber had been stripped clean. The shelves were bare. The jars gone. The stone door left wide open as if mocking the very idea of concealment. Even the cave beneath the hillside had been partially collapsed, rocks piled intentionally, blocking the entrance. Whatever bodies lay beneath were now trapped beyond reach. Only one thing remained untouched. On a table near the parlor window lay Mr. Fairchild's pocket watch, the same one missing from his body during burial. A taunt. A message. They had been here only hours before. And now they were gone. The sheriff turned to Dr. Harrison, his voice grim. "Wherever they're heading, they won't stop. We need to alert Philadelphia, Washington, every township along the road west." But the months that followed proved something chilling. The Hartwells had mastered disappearance. No registry of wagons recorded their passage. No travelers recalled their faces. No shopkeepers remembered selling them supplies. It was as if the family dissolved into the frontier like a shadow swallowed by dusk. Most people in Milbrook refused to believe any of it. Good people. God-fearing people. They couldn't accept that the family who had comforted them in moments of grief had been the cause of that grief all along. They brushed aside Dr. Harrison's warnings, claiming the journal was fabricated, that the doctor misunderstood medical anomalies, that the Hartwells were kind souls framed by outsiders. Denial wrapped the town like fog. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. When another winter death occurred, this one appearing natural, people whispered behind closed doors. When sickness struck a household, neighbors hesitated before accepting help. The trust that defined Milbrook began to crumble, replaced by fear, suspicion, and resentment. Families moved away. Shops closed. Fields went untended. By 1830, Milbrook was half abandoned. By 1860, the building stood empty, overtaken by vines and silence. But the Hartwell story did not die with the town. In the years following their disappearance, Dr. Harrison continued his work as a traveling physician, but every journey he took carried a different purpose now. He searched for signs, strange deaths, patterns of illness, bodies with unusual markings. He traveled through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, always arriving too late, always finding the same whisper of a trail. In some towns, elderly widows had died suddenly after visits from a kind family passing through. In others, travelers vanished mysteriously near roads where a funeral wagon had been spotted. A carpenter in Indiana claimed he had sold coffin wood to a man who looked like Ezekiel. A tavern owner in Illinois swore had seen a woman resembling Martha carrying a basket of herbs. A pastor in Ohio remembered a young girl with gentle eyes who asked many questions about the sick in his congregation. By the time the doctor reached those towns, the deaths had already been buried. The strangers had vanished. And the fear, buried under layers of denial, lingered like a bruise across the community. Harrison documented everything. Every rumor. Every recurring method. Every disappearance too precise to be coincidence. His colleagues called him obsessive. Some called him paranoid. A few thought grief and exhaustion had broken his mind. But he knew the truth. The Hartwells were alive. And wherever they went, death followed. 2 decades passed. Winter 1847 arrived with harsh storms across the Oregon Territory. Settlers spoke of sickness sweeping through their small communities, strange illnesses that left bodies pale, cold, and marked by bruises that made little sense. Some whispered of a family called the Caldwells, who operated a funeral parlor on the edge of a forest settlement. The Caldwells were kind, people said. The Caldwells were helpful. The Caldwells took in the sick and comforted the dying. The name made Dr. Harrison's blood run cold. In October of that year, a letter arrived at his home in Philadelphia. It was from a sheriff in the Oregon Territory, and it began with one sentence. "We believe we have found your Hartwells." Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s, frail but still sharp, traveled west using every ounce of strength left in his body. The journey took months. The roads were treacherous, the weather brutal. But he pressed on until he finally reached a rough frontier town surrounded by towering pines. There he saw them. The funeral parlor, the cellar door, the stone-faced building eerily reminiscent of Milbrook. And the sheriff who had written to him greeted him with a grim expression. "We raided the place 3 weeks ago," he said. "We found bodies, experiments, tools, records, at least 30 victims." The doctor's hands shook. "Where are they?" he asked. "In custody," the sheriff replied. "Prison. Ezekiel, Martha, Josiah, Caleb, Rebecca, all of them." The doctor insisted on seeing them. What he found chilled him to the bone. The Hartwells were older. Ezekiel, now a gaunt, gray-haired patriarch with eyes like cold stones. Martha's once pleasant face had hardened into a mask of disdain. Josiah and Caleb, now grown men, kept their heads high as if proud of their work. Rebecca, no longer a child, watched the doctor with quiet, analytical curiosity. "Dr. Harrison," Ezekiel said calmly when they were alone before the trial, "we wondered when you would catch up." The doctor's voice shook. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you do this? Why so many?" Ezekiel smiled faintly. "Why does a carpenter perfect his craft?" He answered. "Why does a scholar seek knowledge? We did what we were meant to do. Death was our teacher. We simply learned." He leaned closer. "And there are others now. Families we taught. Methods we shared. You can kill us, doctor, but you cannot kill what we created." The trial lasted weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The community was horrified. The jury did not deliberate long. Ezekiel Hartwell was executed by hanging in December 1847. Martha followed him days later. Josiah shortly after. Caleb received life imprisonment, dying in his cell in 1852. Rebecca, who claimed coercion, though no one believed her, received 20 years. She died under mysterious circumstances in 1851, found lifeless in her bunk with no visible cause. Even in death, she left no trace. Dr. Harrison returned to Philadelphia carrying the weight of victory and defeat intertwined. He had helped bring justice to more than 100 victims. He had ended the most prolific family of killers in early American history. But the words Ezekiel spoke haunted him each night as he tried to sleep. There are others now. Long after the trial, strange deaths continued to appear in frontier towns, isolated cases, unexplained illnesses, bodies marked with signs that medical men recognized but could not explain. Dr. Harrison cataloged every one. When he died in 1853, his journals filled several shelves, detailed accounts of every investigation, every rumor, every pattern he believed connected to the Hartwells or their successors. His work remained buried in government archives, sealed away to prevent panic. The world moved on. The towns they touched rebuilt or disappeared. Milbrook faded into dust. But the legacy of the Hartwells lived on in whispers, in forgotten graves, in towns that vanished from maps, and in the possibility that somewhere, generations later, a new family learned the same methods, the same careful watchfulness, the same hunger for control over life and death. The story of the Hartwells teaches one final truth. Evil rarely appears as a monster. Sometimes, it comes wearing a warm smile, a comforting voice, a prayer whispered over the dying. Sometimes, evil lives inside the very hands that prepare the dead while creating them.